your clothes, but if you're indoors, you might not get
germs,
actually burned. So I think it's like this is like just an estimate, like where you're most likely to get those. But according to this, it says even throughout layers of the skin. So
that's insane. Like Mahone Bay is well within that. So if downtown Halifax got nuked, like just right in the middle of the harbor, you're getting a 3rd-degree burn from it in Mahone Bay. At 100 megatons, of course.
Yeah, this is the largest theoretical one. But even if you like use like the largest nuke in the current U.S. arsenals, HRM is still screwed. But less people outside the HRM get screwed. But you were just asking though about the satellite wars.
Oh yeah.
So like there's some like I think some good examples of satellite wars would be like the Yemen. I can never say it right. Yemen is a country on the Arabian Peninsula that is currently it's been undergoing civil strife for quite a while, but it's come to a head recently between a rebel group that if my understanding is predominantly of a certain Muslim sect, the Shiites. I think they're called the Houthis or the Houthis. I can never pronounce it, but they're supposedly backed by Iran. Iran in Saudi Arabia don't get along very well, and Saudi Arabia is trying to crush this rebel group, so it's seen as a satellite war between those two countries. Okay. The United States, you could say a satellite war between the Soviet Union and the United States was funding the conflicts in Vietnam and Afghanistan during the Cold War. Those would be kind of considered satellite wars. Syria is an example where you have Turkey, Russia, the United States, Saudi Arabia, those countries all funding different groups to essentially kill each other, to either promote stability or promote instability. I guess it depends on who you ask. I mean, it's insanity. Lebanon, there's a group there called Hezbollah. I'm sure we've heard about. In a number of years ago, there was a war between Hezbollah and Israel that resulted in quite a widespread devastation in Lebanon when Israel bombarded several cities in Lebanon. Though Hezbollah is funded by Iran, and there's a very close relationship militarily between Iran and Hezbollah in Syria right now. So that's a satellite war. I mean, those kinds of things only happen because the countries that are funding these countries can't face off against each other, either because of the threat of nuclear war or just because the cost of actually fighting a war between each other would be too great. The United States funded both Iraq and Iran in the Iran-Iraq war. I mean, it's just insane. But there's
gnarly.
And Ukraine is a satellite war. Russia is funding rebel groups and actually directly supporting rebel groups in eastern Ukraine. Canada is beginning to fund Ukraine. I mean, wow. So it's crazy. Like it's while there is a certain amount of peace enjoyed by a lot of people because of nuclear arms, these other little conflicts can happen still.
So it's like just like such a fucking double-edged sword. Like,
yeah.
Us experiencing peace as a result, perhaps because we just can't engage in conflict with each other because we would destroy each other, and then there's no game to play. So get these people who can't exactly destroy each other to fight instead or something. And it's just like resulting in just turmoil on the other side of things.
And it's probably going to eventually slip beyond our control. I mean, it sort of has. I mean, the United States and Russia, they're facing off in Syria. I don't think it's actually so bad in Syria in terms between the United States and Russia as the media makes it out to be. But I mean, they definitely the Syrian regime is supported by Russia. The United States has backed many rebel groups that the Syrian regime is trying to. I shouldn't say many. I don't know how many the U.S. has backed. I shouldn't claim to know that. But they have backed rebel groups with Islamic jihadist ties. Like these are jihadist groups that the United States is funding. Some of them are committing very heinous crimes, my understanding. And Russia's bombing these rebel groups along with the Syrian regime. So obviously Russia and the U.S. have different interests there. Russia is into they're not as their campaign in Syria hasn't been quite as harsh towards the Kurdish forces, the SDF. They're a U.S. supported group there that aren't really I don't know what their deal is, but I think they're primarily a Kurdish group, but they also contain Arabs and other ethnicities like some of the Assyrian groups in northern Syria. They formed kind of this coalition to fight against ISIS. Essentially, the Syrian government dropped the ball. They didn't, they weren't successful in handling ISIS. So when ISIS came in and started committing this, all these atrocities, this primarily Kurdish group fought against ISIS. They were backed by the U.S. The U.S. was pretty instrumental in providing with the weapons necessary to defend themselves. But now that the war in Syria is kind of coming to a close, at least in this between ISIS and the SDF and the Syrian Arab Army, there has been some tensions with Russia in this group. But I think ultimately Russia and the United States don't particularly want to go to war over it. But
Dylan, who was here last week, was talking about the Kurdish army, how like we have it set up with Canada. There's like a part of our military that accepts volunteers to go fight with them, not because we're necessarily allies, but because we share a similar enemies. So like you can go and sign up for the Kurdish army, and like as a Canadian, just like go like, yeah, I'm ready to go. Send me over there. You just go fight. You don't get paid, but
lots of Westerners have done that. So in addition to the amount of Westerners going to fight for ISIS, there's been a strong movement of people to go fight with the Kurds. Some of this is because of communism. My understanding is that the People's Working Party of Kurdistan, I think that's what they're called, the PKK. I could be wrong. I think they are a communist party. So a lot of communist groups online, I've noticed, even one that I got added to, there was people talking about going over to fight with the Kurds, and you hear about it quite a bit. Like I followed the Kurdish group through Reddit, the Kurdish group, the Kurds, the SDF, through Reddit. There's a Syrian civil war subreddit where you can follow the Twitter accounts of many Kurdish people or journalists embedded with the Kurds, or Westerners who've gone to fight with the Kurds. A lot of them have died. It's tragic. You hear about Westerners going over, and it's kind of romanticized. The Kurdish struggle is romanticized, and sometimes I think it kind of is done to their detriment because people sort of see them as like entirely good when they kind of overlook some of the bad things that some Kurdish groups have done. But I'm ultimately very sympathetic towards the Kurdish struggle because I've primarily been consuming media that portrays them in a good light. But I certainly have seen evidence that it's not all roses and candy. That's not a saying, is it? It is now. But then you consider the fact that a lot of Westerners really like Kurdistan. You have Turkey, who does not like the idea of the Kurdistan movement gaining any traction. Turkish forces have bombarded the SDF. They've attacked Kurdish groups in northern Iraq. Iraq has a very large Kurdish minority in northern Iraq. And recently, it looked like tension between the Iraqi security forces and the Kurdish forces might escalate to a civil war. But thankfully, that doesn't seem to be happening. There was a referendum both in Syrian Kurdistan and Iraqi Kurdistan where the Kurds voted for independence, and both countries of Syria and Iraq were like, no, we're not signing off on that. Like, you may have voted in favor of this, but that's ridiculous. That's not in our interest as a country. So it seems like a lot of the Kurdish sovereignty movement has kind of been like, okay, well, we'll not acknowledge that election as being binding towards an actual separatist movement for now, which is, I think, good. Not that I think that Iraq deserves to keep Kurdistan, because the Iraqi security forces dropped the ball. ISIS came in and steamrolled through the Iraqi security forces and left the Kurds basically fend for themselves. They fought really hard with American support and Canadian support. Canadians were training Iraqi Kurds, is my understanding. So they fought really hard, and I'm sure they feel like they've earned sovereignty. But at the end of the day, it's not in the best interests of Iraq, I guess, for them to suddenly just separate. And you've got all these countries like Iran, Syria, Iraq, and Turkey who are like, we don't want you guys to separate. And it seems really unfair, but I'm sure it's
man, it sounds like there's so much turmoil and activity going on in those countries. They're just like borders are shifting and people are trying to take over and insurgents coming in, rebels, and just like everything's so unstable in that area of the world. Like, you can only imagine trying to live there.
That's not something that actually, I'm glad you pointed out. Imagine trying to live there. This is something that really frustrates me about the West right now. When I hear people talk about all these people fleeing the war zone, people think, well, look what happened in Europe in World War II. We had all these people signing up to go fight, and then I see all these young men coming from Syria and they're not fighting. What the hell's up with that? And I just used a really weird accent for some reason. But the reason is, it's like you look at World War II. You had Nazis and their allies. You did have some movements that were groups that were the resistance in the countries, but essentially they had the same aim as the Allies, to get rid of Nazis. And then you had the Allies. In Syria, you have so many different rebel groups that are... Each of these rebel groups, they had good aims at the beginning, but a lot of them have been co-opted by jihadist, hardline Islamist factions that basically are no better than ISIS. And then you have ISIS, and then you have the Syrian Arab army that, despite many well-intentioned Syrians fighting in that group against this rebel forces, they're part of an army that has indiscriminately bombed entire neighborhoods of a bunch of cities in Syria, with really like no regard with whether there were civilians in those neighborhoods or not. And you hear about chemical warfare with the Syrian regime. I mean, it's not the same kind of war, and it's really disappointing to see so many people in Canada who just assume that all these Syrians running away are running away because they're cowards. There's tons of extremely brave Syrians who are trying to fight for some semblance of justice in their country, and there's a lot of people who really don't know who to fight. How do you choose which group to fight with? And how do you... And guess what? There's tons of people who are fighting for ISIS who are conscripted kids, young teenagers, who had no fucking choice. I have no doubt that there are tons of Syrians who were forced to fight when they really did not want to. Because ultimately it is not the same as the kind of warfare that you saw in World War II and World War I. And we should... And then that gets me on a whole other thought process of why are we even glorifying the massive waves of conscription, this crazy industrial warfare that World War I and World War II were, very different wars. And I don't think anyone could argue that it wasn't a good thing to fight the Nazis. That's not what I'm saying. But the whole craziness of the fact that it culminated in that. I mean, it's the fact that it happened shouldn't be a glowing review of Western culture either. Like, not to shit on Western culture, because it's certainly not a bad thing. But at the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is the arrogance, the smugness of Westerners criticizing the amount of people fleeing the Syrian conflict frustrates me. That's what I'm trying to say. And I'm not trying to say that we should open our borders and just take everyone from all those countries either, because that leaves those countries at a disadvantage. So huge brain drain. Those countries won't be able to thrive if their populations are going. But all I'm saying is the smugness and arrogance is what really frustrates me when it comes to Westerners critiquing the fleeing people, and I really have no doubt that our country would, if there was civil war, that there'd be any difference. Oh,
there'd be, yeah. Like, it's like the whole Gardner and the War thing. Like, there's so many people in our country that just aren't, they can hardly survive without their cell phone. It's like, how they're gonna survive when fucking buildings are blowing up and shit, people you love are being exploded around you and shit. And just especially when you explain the sheer complexity of the situation with all these different insurgent groups and different rebels fighting, like. It sounds like sheer mayhem, and I think one of the reasons that Canada's doing well with the refugee crisis more than like Sweden, as we found out last week, is like I've been talking with some other military buddies, and they've been talking about how like we've mostly been trying to let in like families of people in Canada, and this could be misinformation. I haven't looked at it myself, but my understanding so far is that we've been letting in more families, whereas other countries are just kind of letting in anyone. Like, you have a lot of these like younger men coming in, and younger men are just naturally aggressive humans, so Canada, I think, has been trying to let in more families, and so that's been adding to the stability. But still, like, my buddy's living in Ocean Towers downtown, and there's an apartment across this hallway where they got like 2 full-size Muslim families stuffed into one apartment. It's just another issue with the refugee crisis that definitely needs to be talked about without people jumping down each other's throats about Islamophobia and stuff. It's just like, what do you do with all the people? Where do you put them all? Like, we're stuffing like 2 full-blown families, probably with like 5 or 6 kids each, in one apartment in Ocean Towers in Halifax. It's like, where are we going to put these people? Where's the infrastructure? Just like for a sudden, migration of humans, just suddenly, like, this populations of cities are just rising because of this all of a sudden. It's like, I mean, I think Canada's doing a good job screening people and letting people in and finding homes for them and stuff. It's probably not ideal. It's probably better than the refugee camps they just came from.
Yeah.
But I think it sounds like a crazy issue. I mean, like, what do we do with how do you find houses for everybody, and how do you like get education for everybody, and it's just like, how do you assimilate all these people into the culture? And It's a huge logistical nightmare. I can only imagine, because you can't not help them either too. Like we can't not let anyone in. It's like that would be way too conservative. And then like what you said, just opening the doors for everyone is way too